Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are making strong progress through the Psalms. We only have 141 to go. We're actually on Psalm 9 today. And as we look at Psalm 9, one thing you'll notice, and hopefully you've read it before you do this study, is that some of the themes here are very similar to some of the themes that we've read about in the past from the Psalms of David. Things like God's justice, how he punishes the evil people, but he takes care of the righteous, the people who are trying to do the right thing. There's a picture of God as judge, and David is calling God's judgment down on his enemies who are oppressing him. You might say, well, why is he writing another psalm about this? We have to remember that David, especially in his early life, spent a lot of time running from his enemies, praying to God for deliverance, being oppressed because he was God's anointed king. But there were people who opposed that idea. There were people who opposed him as the next king, namely Saul, who was the current king of Israel and Judah. So David was just, following God's instructions, and Saul is pursuing him, chasing him, trying to kill him, so he's constantly under threat. And so it makes sense that David prays these similar prayers as these years go on, and he's under these continual threats. And we'll see him also praising God for past deliverances. So with all of that, let's talk author. We've already discussed this. David is the author. It tells us in the first verse of the psalm. New Testament references. I'm not aware of any references in the New Testament back to Psalm 9. Let me know if you think that you've found one down in the comment section. Themes. As I mentioned, these are similar to what we've seen in previous psalms. First of all, God sits on his throne of judgment forever. He's the ultimate judge. He will never be dethroned. Now, that's in contrast to other nations. God is going to humble proud and wicked nations, and it says that he's going to erase all memory of them from the earth. So, utter destruction if you oppose God. No one's even going to remember you. He is to be feared by wicked men. That's theme number 3. And then number 4, he's to be feared by wicked men, but he's a stronghold for those who are trying to do what's right and those who are oppressed. Okay. Now, definitions. Some interesting words to talk about here. One we've already seen in a previous chapter, but this first one we have not. Muthlaben. That's the pronunciation I'm going to go with. Some people, you'll see this in the introduction to the psalm in verse 1. Some people believe that Muthlaben was a popular tune to which this psalm was written. Other people, a minority of people, believe that Muthlaben was a particular instrument that was supposed to be played when this psalm was performed or when it was sung. And then we have, again, the word Sheol, which I believe we came across in chapter 6, or Psalm 6. The idea that's conveyed by the word Sheol, as Albert Barnes has in his commentary, or Hades, is not properly a grave or a sepulcher, but that dark, unknown state, including the grave, which constitutes the dominion of the dead. I know that's somewhat of a difficult definition, but it's probably the most concise that I've read that I have confidence in. Kind of the blackness, the mystery of the grave and where people go when they die. And, some of that was unknown to some of these people of the ancient days. And so it's referred to as Sheol. It's used several times in the Old Testament. It's an interesting word to do a word study on. All right, so that takes us over to page number 2. And once again, I've got all 20 verses under just one heading. God, the eternal King, and the just judge. So David begins the psalm by praising God for some of his previous deeds, specifically for God's deliverance of David from his enemies in the past. God defended David because, as David said, he was fighting for a just cause. He was trying to do what was right. David asked for God's righteous judgment to fall on his enemies and the perpetrators of evil. As we mentioned in a previous psalm, this is an imprecation. It's an imprecatory psalm where the writer is calling for God's judgment on the wicked. The text says that God had destroyed wicked nations in the past, destroyed them to the point where they disappeared from the earth. They were uprooted completely. And in contrast to that, to those kingdoms that only last as long as God, permits them to, God's throne is established in heaven forever. That's where he's judging from. That's where he's reigning from. That's how we know that righteousness is always going to be upheld. David presents God as the afflicter of evil men and the avenger of the afflicted man. He encouraged people to sing praises to God for this characteristic because God cares for people who are oppressed. He cares about the weak and the lowly in the world who are often mistreated by others. God caused evil people to fall into their own traps and to get caught in their own snares. And we read about that a lot in the Old Testament history. David wanted God to rise up in power against evil nations and to humble them by reminding them that they were mere men in the face of the ultimate power of the creator of the universe. They were not going to succeed. Didn't matter how much evil they did, how much they promoted it. They're not going to succeed. They're going to end up in the grave, in Sheol, and God's victory is certain in the end. And towards the end of the psalm, we see this statement of optimism about the future. David writes, quote, "For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever." God is going to make everything right in the end. For application today, I want to talk about how this psalm is actually very applicable to our modern world. Things haven't really changed that much since David wrote this psalm. The powerful still oppress the weak. The wicked still scatter seeds of evil into the world. Godless nations still rage against God and try to suppress the knowledge of Him. And perhaps you've been mistreated for your faith in God, for supporting a just cause, like David says in verse 4. We can pray this same psalm. We can pray that God maintains us, that He's our stronghold, that the wicked stumble and fall into their own snares, that evil nations and rulers get humbled, that the needy aren't forgotten, that evil men will be smitten by the fear of God and realize that their fight is hopeless, that God will sit on His throne forever and bring justice to the world. Upon your first reading of Psalm 9, and probably all the Psalms for that matter, the language of the author probably seems a little bit foreign to us. Maybe we wouldn't necessarily express ourselves with those same expressions or terms or phrases, right? But what we find is that when we look under the surface, the sentiments, the emotions that are being expressed in Psalm 9 are the same things that we often cry out to God for in our modern world, right? And I think this is a good lesson as we read the Psalms. I'd encourage you to, you might read them and you might be like, this language is kind of strange. I don't really relate to this. It doesn't touch my heart or, emotionally I'm not affected by it upon first reading. But if we look a little bit deeper and we look at the emotions, the pleas, the expressions, the sentiments that are being expressed by that language, and we try to understand that, I think what we'll find is we'll actually really relate to a lot of Psalms, even though those Psalms were written 3,000 years before we're living in the modern day.